gonna turn when you can't turn back for the bridges you burned? And fate can't wait to kick you in the butt. Then what? Whoa, then what?
He was born in 1969 in Texas, Vidor, Texas to be exact, on I-10 between Houston and Baton Rouge. Now, Vidor, in the nearby town of Beaumont, Texas, which Clay calls home today, has a rich musical history like few other towns. From this blue-collar town have come country music greats like George Jones, who was raised in Vidor, and 1990s country stars Tracy Byrd and Mark Chestnut, who we'll hear more about in Clay's story today. So the area of Texas where Clay was raised, much like the entire state of Texas itself, was just dripping with country music talent. Now, when I research videos and information for these videos, I usually like to go to books and biographies. Since Clay Walker hasn't written a book about his life yet, I turned to podcasts, and one of the most helpful I found was this one, The Road You Leave Behind, by ESPN personality Marty Smith. He interviewed Clay Walker. If you want to learn more about Clay Walker, I'll link to that podcast in the video description below. All right, back to Clay's story. It also helped that Clay came from a musically gifted family. You see, Clay's dad sang really well and played the guitar, and Clay's granddad played for fellow Texan and country music pioneer Tex Ritter. So Clay got his first guitar when he was 9, and by the age of 15, he was entering and winning singing contests. Now, from a young age, it was pretty clear that Clay Walker had a singing voice that people wanted to hear more of. But Clay didn't just play and sing, he also wrote his own songs back then and still today. And Clay knew from a pretty young age exactly what he wanted to do in life. He wanted to be a country music singer. So Clay started playing out as much as he could as a teenager. What, might you ask, was Clay Walker's first gig he sang at that he got paid? Well, there's a story behind that, and you'll want to hear it because it involves the great George Jones. But first, please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. That way you'll be notified anytime a new video comes out. And if you'd like to support the storytelling of the heroes, history, and heritage of your country music, you can do so at patreon.com/stories of country music. Just click on the Patreon link that I'll put in the video description below. All right, so back to Clay Walker's first paying gig. I've already dropped the hint that it was George Jones who paid him for his first gig, but how did that come to pass? Well, you remember, George Jones was raised in the same town that Clay Walker grew up in, that is Vidor, Texas. So they, of course, knew about each other. And when Clay was 16, George hired Clay to sing at the Jones Country Music Park about an hour away from Vidor. Now, not only did George pay Clay to open for him, George also stopped by and listened to Clay during his sound check. As you might imagine, Clay remembers this very distinctly. He said this, Clay said, George Jones didn't have to stay around until I finished my sound check, but he did. He made it a point to. And what did George tell Clay after his sound check was done? Well, George told Clay, you're going to make it. You don't have it yet. You have to get better, but you're going to make it. I can hear it. Well, as you might imagine, having George Jones encourage you at 16 years old gives you a world of confidence. And that's exactly what it gave young Clay Walker. So Clay decided to push things a little harder. On his way back from work one day, he stopped in at his local radio station and banged on the door until someone finally answered, and Clay dropped off a recording of a song he had written, hoping that the radio station would play it. But Clay was turned away. You see, the radio station had a strict policy against playing submitted music, and they said, Clay, it's just not going to happen. Well, that is, until the morning DJ actually listened to Clay's song, and then the DJ broke the rules. He played Clay's song on the radio anyway, saying it was just too good to pass up. And a cool story here, Clay Walker heard his music on the radio for the very first time while driving out of the parking lot of that radio station. How cool is that? Now, getting such great feedback so fast encouraged Clay to set his sights even higher. And at 17 years old, Clay Walker took off to Nashville. Now, he didn't have a penny to his name, and he slept in his car on the way to Tennessee. And then Clay did what you do on Music Row. Like so many desperate singers before, Clay took his demo tape from label to label to label. And like George Strait, like Garth Brooks, like Willie Nelson, and dozens of others you've heard about, he was turned down by every single label. In fact, one label exec told Clay, he said this, he said, "You really don't have that great of a singing voice, but your songs are pretty good. Maybe you should quit trying to sing and focus on your writing instead." Well, of course, Clay was crushed, but he was equally defiant. He thought, all right, you don't think I can sing? Just watch me. And he headed back to Texas, ready to give everything he had to his singing career. There was just this one little problem, and that was Mama Walker. You see, she wanted Clay to go to college. No one in the Walker family had been to college, and Clay being the oldest of 5 children, Mama Walker wanted Clay to set an example. So Clay and his mom made a deal. Clay would sing for 4 years, the same length it would take the time to get through college, and if he didn't have a record deal in those 4 years, he'd go to college. His mama agreed, and the clock started ticking. So Clay got to work, literally. Like, he had to support himself now, so he got a job at the Goodyear plant in Beaumont. He'd work his day job, go take a short nap, get up and play until 2 a.m., come home, take another short nap, and be up and ready for work the next day. Now, Clay was working 5 days a week and playing 5 nights a week. He kept up this crazy schedule for a year or two until he got hired by the Neon Armadillo Bar in Beaumont to sing there full-time as their house band. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Tracy Byrd and Mark Chestnut were playing in the same bars in the same town. And while they were a couple of years older and a little bit further along in their career, Beaumont folks knew what good country music was supposed to sound like. And they weren't going to take anything less. So Clay did what George Jones told him to do. He got better. He had to if he was going to make it. And then, just like it happens at least once in the life of every country music hero we've ever heard of, lightning struck, and Clay was ready. One night, while Clay was playing, a guy from Louisiana walks into the bar, stands in the back, and listens. He listens to Clay for about an hour and a half or so, and then after the show, he walks up to Clay and says, "You sound really great, and I can tell everybody loves listening to you. I've been watching them." Clay says, "I'll tell you what. I'm going to send someone by next week that's going to change your life." Not long after that, this guy just leaves. Now, Clay, of course, he didn't know what to think. He really didn't believe this guy because he had been promised things before and, they hadn't turned out. But sure enough, one night that very next week, in walks James Stroud. Now, James Stroud was a Nashville record producer working with the folks like Clint Black, Little Texas, Charlie Daniels. So after being introduced, Clay started his set for the night. But after about 6 to 7 songs of playing, this Mr. James Stroud just gets up, walks out without saying a word to Clay. Well, Clay didn't know what to think, but he knew he wasn't about to let this Nashville producer walk away from him without at least talking to him. So he stops his set, kind of chases after Mr. Stroud, catches up with him while he's at his car, and Clay asks, he says, "Mr. Stroud, what, did I do anything wrong? Did I do anything to offend you, put you off? What happened?" And James Stroud just looked at Clay and said, "No, son, you're a superstar. I'll see you in Nashville in 2 weeks. We're going to cut us a record." And that, my friends, is exactly what happened. Clay cut a record in 1993 produced by this same James Stroud. Now, that record was called Clay Walker, and it had a couple of #1 hits you might be familiar with, like this one, "What's It to You?"
If you feel it, get in the groove. Love is a rhythm of 2 hearts beating, pounding out a message, steady and true.
And there was a second #1 hit that came off that record, and it's this song right here, Live Until I Die.
And I don't want to think about tomorrow. I don't need anything, money.
At this time, Clay Walker was just 24 years old. And of course, this was just the beginning of success for Mr. Walker. His next album earned him 3 more #1 hits, bringing his total to 5 #1 hits by the young age of 25. And his success would continue, but not without great personal trials, including being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the age of 26, and literally being told he'd be in a wheelchair by the time he was 30, and dead not long after that. Clay was able to beat this disease, and it's a miraculous tale that he tells very well, and I will be making a video on that. More about Clay Walker's music, more about his career, and definitely about his fight with multiple sclerosis. It's something you'll definitely want to hear. I hope to be able to put that video out very soon. But all that is a story for another day.